everyone. So clearly, as I stated on Sakai, for some reason Screenomatic did not record my audio, so I have to redo this video again. So the best thing I thought to do was leave the uploaded PowerPoint on Sakai, but I'll upload a recording of me talking. Hopefully everything kind of aligns, or I'll make sure to state the title so you're aware of which slide I'm talking about. So I chose to do the topic of emotional child abuse for this presentation. Just because I feel like it's an interesting topic, and I think that, child abuse in general gets a lot of publicity, but specifically physical abuse, and I think that a lot of people often kind of forget about the emotional abuse aspect of it and how that can sometimes be like the silent killer, so I chose to focus on that for my presentation. So first, I want to do what is emotional child abuse, and to define general child abuse as any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker, which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Specifically, I also then wanted to define what emotional child abuse is, which is a pattern of behavior that impairs a child's emotional development or sense of self-worth, according to child welfare information. And while researching this, I actually found out, it was interesting, so from CAPTA, which is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, that actually sets up, federal legislation throughout all states to set the precedents for child abuse in general when that happens. But each state actually is able to provide its own definition of maltreatment within civil and criminal statutes, which I was not aware of before this. So that was something I was informed of while researching this information for this presentation. Some behavioral examples of emotional child abuse are rejecting, which is the caregiver refuses to acknowledge the child's worth and legitimacy of the child's needs, and then isolating, which is the adult cuts the child off from normal social experiences, prevents the child from forming friendships, and makes the child believe that he or she is alone in the world. Obviously, both of these can be pretty debilitating because, in a sense, the rejecting also isolates the child and takes away that sense of love and affection from the parent. Terrorizing, the adult creates a climate of fear, bullies, and frightens the child, and makes the child believe that the world is a very hostile place, which can really set up some negative lenses for the child as they grow and go throughout their lifespan. Ignoring, the adult deprives the child of essential stimulation and responsiveness, which is kind of similar to rejecting and isolating, since it takes away that innate need and desire for affection from your caregiver. And as we talked about with attachments, how important that is in those initial stages of your life. Corrupting, so the adult encourages the child to engage in destructive and antisocial behavior, reinforces deviance, and impairs the child's ability to behave in socially appropriate ways. So a good example of this would be if an 8-year-old child lives in a home where both of his or her parents, are addicted to drugs and or alcohol, and since that's just the norm in the environment, maybe the parents give the 8-year-old child a beer to try it or to have it. And this becomes a norm for the child, and so in that sense, the parents are corrupting the child by putting them in this toxic and negative environment, which can then affect them throughout their lifespan. Verbally assaulting, the adult humiliates the child with repeated name-calling, harsh threats, and sarcasm that continually beat down the child and make them feel worthless and question their own self-worth and lower their self-esteem. And I think that this seems to be one of the most commonly assumed forms of emotional child abuse, which clearly it is one of the main forms, but I think that a lot of people forget about all these other forms because you normally just think, verbally assaulting, you kind of relate that with emotional abuse, but so it was nice to still just learn more about that. And then overpressuring, the adult imposes extreme pressure upon the child to behave and achieve in ways that are far beyond the child's capabilities. I would definitely characterize that as something that's pretty prevalent nowadays, where a lot of maybe helicopter parents and also parents in general want their kids to be really well-rounded, and so they put an immense amount of pressure on them to do well in school and excel in both the classroom and outside of the classroom, whether it's sports or in music and arts and any other area of life. And so I think that this can put a lot of negative pressure on the students or on the children if parents or other caretakers go over the edge. So then for the next slide, signs of emotional abuse in the child. There's fear or resentment toward the parent. So Essentially, the child might express fear or hatred towards their parent and verbally state that they hate their parent. Of course, I'm sure at every point in time some kid has said, or teenager, that I hate my parents, I hate my mom, I hate my dad. So that doesn't necessarily scream emotional child abuse. Excuse me, but it's if a child is continuously making this statement, it might be a red flag to potential emotional abuse from their caretaker. Low self-esteem. So if if the child is talking badly about themselves, constantly saying I'm stupid, or I'm not good at anything, I'm never good at anything, I'm not enough. Again, I'm sure at some point in their lifespan, children make these comments once in a while, but if it becomes a constant theme, there's definitely something deeper going on there. Sudden change in behavior. So if a student who typically does really well in school all of a sudden isn't showing up, their grades are slipping, their work ethic's changed, or even if their typical hobbies and interests, they're no longer partaking in those during or after school, that can be a huge red flag. If things that they're really interested in and passionate about, they no longer have that passion or desire to do. And also if people or kids who are really social and typically partake in social activities, whether it's going to their friends' houses or doing clubs, all of a sudden if they're not doing these things and they're staying home, that can be a huge red flag as well, and a change in their behavior that's negative. Developmental regression or delayed emotional development. So essentially, this can be, say, an 8-year-old who is already potty trained and they have bowel control, but all of a sudden they're 8 years old and now they're regressing and they're now wetting the bed or soiling out in public, and so that can be a huge red flag to, okay, they already have this control, what's kind of going on here that's triggering this to now lose control. So that can be a huge thing. And also students who are seemingly very immature for their age, that can be a big red flag as well. Desperately seeks affection from other adults. So clearly if a child is being emotionally abused, they're not getting the affection and love and attention that they need at home. So they might avidly be seeking that love and attention from other adults in their life. So that can be a big red sign of emotional abuse. Physical complaints, saying that they have headaches, stomach aches, they don't feel well, they have a cold, but there are no medical or other physical signs to back that up. It could be more of an internal turmoil that's making them feel so nauseous or sick or have a headache due to the stress or the fear and other symptoms underlying from emotional abuse. And then lastly, some signs of mental health issues. So if a student, if a child is stressing and has signs of depression and anxiety, that can be a sign of stemming from emotional abuse. If they have a low quality of life, or if all of a sudden their self-worth is really shot and they're feeling really negative about themselves, again, that can be a sign that they might be depressed or facing issues of anxiety. So then signs of emotional abuse in the adult, a lack or non-existent existence of physical affection. So say that, the parent or caregiver or whoever the abuser is, there's not touching or holding the child affectionately, there's no kissing, no hugging, no praising the child with high fives. So that can be a huge sign if a parent is not doing that with their child, that they might be emotionally abusing them. Lack or non-existence of emotional affection. So an example of that would be if the parent is showing little or no regard for the child's emotional needs, there's a lack of love, lack of positive self-esteem boosting, and they show little concern for the child. So that lack of emotional caretaking and need, if that's not there, that can be a sign that the parent is emotionally abusive. Not tending to the child's medical needs. So again, kind of like our case studies a few of them talked about in our textbook, how if a child comes to you and says my knee really hurts, and the parent just blatantly ignores them and tells them to toughen up and don't be weak, and you're fine, and they're clearly the child is in pain and the parent isn't doing anything about it, can be emotional abuse and also neglect as well. So that can be a sign that the child is being emotionally abused. Also blaming, belittling, or berating the child, clearly that negative talk can be a sign if it's a constant thing. Openly admitting dislike or hate of the child, if they're in public and they're like, yeah, I absolutely hate my child, again, red flag. Unrealistic expectations of the child, and that goes back to the overpressuring, where if a parent is trying to demand this level of physical or academic or social or athletic performance from a child who just doesn't have the skill sets to achieve that, that can be a sign of emotional abuse in and of itself. And then lastly, using a child to complete an emotional need. So typically as a child, you need that emotional love and affection and guidance from your parents, but sometimes when there's a parent who's emotionally abusing a child, there's a role reversal where that parent uses that child and looks to them for care, attention, and satisfaction for their own emotional needs. And so that's definitely a sign to look for as well. So some consequences of emotional child abuse: difficulty maintaining healthy relationships. So for example, emotional abuse, obviously, as we've talked about this whole semester or 3 weeks of class, that emotional abuse can really interfere with the child's ability to form healthy attachments and relationships. And we've talked so much about how important those initial attachments are as a child. So if you are being emotionally abused as a child, those attachments are going to be most likely pretty negative. It might then prolong throughout your lifespan if you're unable to, get help. And if somebody doesn't see those signs early enough to try to then help you. So these people might continue to have difficulty maintaining and even forming, right off the bat, forming healthy relationships with friends, with loved ones, and coaches and teachers and any other, adults in their life. So then increased risk of mental health issues is another big consequence, a potential consequence of emotional child abuse. This can come from, as I mentioned, like depression and anxiety could be signs that a child is suffering emotional abuse. So it's important that these are signs to look for, and then these could even then be prolonged, again, consequences of continuous emotional child abuse that then could lead to this person having prolonged and continuous mental health issues throughout their life. Increased social problems could be huge as well. And this is, some consequences are increased social problems, and that could be then surrounding, it's linked to delinquency and aggression in some adolescents, which again can kind of be tied to some mental health issues or mental illness due to anger management, and that lack of love and that rejection and isolation and other things along those lines. And then another consequence is greater risk of repeating the cycle of abuse. So I feel like most of you probably know that already, but obviously if you have been abused, and even so emotionally abused as well, you are more susceptible to being an abuser, or even then after having that negative attachment style with your caregiver, to then continuously being stuck in those types of negative abuse cycles. So even if even if you don't become the abuser, there's a chance that you put yourself in a situation with, or an intimate relationship or even friendships where you go to someone who has similar negative traits like your parent who is the abuser. So those are some just consequences of being emotionally abused as a child. And then just lastly, some preventative and treatment measures, to become aware of those at higher risk. So obviously, even if somebody does have somebody could have a perfect home as a child, but their parent still could be really angry, or again, it could be a teacher or a babysitter that is emotionally abusing the child and it's not at home. So to become aware of those who are at higher risk, which are those having financial difficulties, if you're a single parent, if a parent is going through a divorce, they might be more likely to emotionally abuse their child, and those struggling with substance use and abuse disorders. So those are people who are more susceptible to emotionally abusing children. So I think it's important to educate and bring more awareness to those who are more susceptible, but also then just education in general surrounding emotional abuse and what that actually means and what that looks like. Public awareness and education, kind of as I just touched upon, can be really important, since it really is a serious issue, and it's not as visible. It's not actually, isn't always as visible as physical abuse, where you can see a broken leg and you can see a bloody lip, but you can't see the emotional distraught a child is facing from being rejected by their parents and ignored and not loved. That isn't always easily seen. So I think that education and awareness is huge. More availability to mental health services. So obviously, as we talked about as well, there are a lot of maybe low socioeconomic status areas, or even just rural areas that don't have as much access to mental health services due to whether it's financials to transport themselves there, or even just being far away from certain mental health services can make things really difficult. So kind of trying to bring more mental health services into those rural areas or closer, or have some type of financial services that can help these families who maybe can't afford it to make sure that their child who isn't being emotionally abused, or by social services to help these children who are being emotionally abused receive the help that they need. And then lastly, just home visiting programs. So that's just a type of program that pretty much can offer education on child development, and then also the appropriate expectations of child, developmental stages, and just also the signs to look for if they are being abused, and then preventative measures along with that. So I think programs like this can really help to improve our understanding of child emotional abuse. And so that could be great for specific homes, but also just in general to help bring more awareness on that subject. And then lastly, I just had some resources. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, focused on child abuse and neglect, Information Gateway, National Child Abuse Hotline, which can be reached 24/7. That can be a great outlet for kids who feel that they're struggling. If you know someone who is struggling, or if you're, a parent and you're thinking that you're emotionally abusing your child and you're thinking twice about it, call the hotline. And then the American Society for the Positive Care of Children. So sorry if that was a little bit quick. I'm sorry that this whole mess up happened with my PowerPoint to this, but I hope that things kind of aligned enough with the way that my PowerPoint went. And basically, like I said, I just thought emotional abuse, child abuse was a topic that sometimes I wouldn't say necessarily gets overlooked, but it's definitely not as, looked upon as being like, oh, it's physical abuse. You see that, you can see that happening, what the signs are, but emotional abuse is a bit more, there's more of a gray area where maybe you don't know. Maybe a kid's just struggling because they're struggling, but maybe they're struggling because they're being emotionally abused. And so it's really helpful to be aware of what those signs could be, both in the child and also from a parent, like I said, or a caregiver, like a babysitter, a teacher, and any other authority figure really could emotionally abuse a child as well. So it's just really important to be aware of those signs and just know what to look for, and also potential preventative measures are always really good to look at.